Hello, everyone. My name is Salah Basalamah, and the title of my paper is What is Arch Translation? So the whole purpose of this paper is to explain the concept of arch translation. So let's start by stating the problem. The problem is that translation is a concept that has evolved a lot since the beginning of the discipline and translation studies. It began as simply an interlinguistic transfer process, then an intercultural communication process, then a cultural product of an environment, a cultural factor of change in different contexts, a process of social agency distribution, an intersystemic mode of exchange, and etc. So, but what translation exists? But translation exists beyond translation studies as well, and in its relationships with other fields increasingly raises many questions. For example, why is translation such a polymorphic concept? Why does its widespread presence of translation in all sorts of fields and disciplines tell us about translation? How can these polymorphic features be of any interest to translation scholars and beyond? Does translation studies have any transdisciplinary potential to offer to the scholarly world? So let's try by thinking about defining translation, because this is usually what philosophers do. And Timoshko says, what most translation scholars would like to believe is that the stage of defining translation is essentially over. Obviously not. It would be satisfying to think that the big parameters regarding translation have been sketched out. This task of defining translation is not finished, and it will continue to be a central trajectory of translation research in the decades to come. So when one examines an object in order to define it, the task is descriptive. But when the scrutiny in defining an object goes in depth, the task becomes philosophical. That's not the only characteristic. In fact, one of the tasks of philosophy is to define the nature of things, which a branch of philosophy is ontology, from a bird's eye view vantage point. In trying to define the concept of translation philosophically, the scope of the translation studies inquiry inevitably expands beyond the discipline. But what means the phrase philosophy of translation, which is now abbreviated by PT? It's a philosophical inquiry about the meaning of the translation concept, its scope, and relationships with other concepts within and outside of translation studies. So it is more ambitious. The thinkers who engaged in this kind of investigation on translation were of various stripes, not only philosophers, by the way. So how to make sense of all what has been termed and deemed as a philosophy of translation? I believe there are at least three broad categories of philosophy of translation. I'm going to do very fast through them, just giving you very big, just the names of those people. The first main type of the philosophy of translation, I believe, were represented by philosophers. You have Schleiermacher, Heidegger, Gadamer, Ricoeur, you have Derrida and Deleuze, you have Quine and Davidson, Berman, Ricoeur, and Giavolino, and all these are of, the kind with their different types of orientations. The second category is translation as studied by translation studies insiders and neighboring field scholars, such as mainly postcolonial studies. Of course, you have Benjamin, who kind of one of the major ancient figures, Rushdie, Baba, Young, Chaffetz, Boudin, and Novotny, Niranjana, and Bandya, and also, of course, all the ethnographers, Talal Asad, Evans Pritchard, and so on and so forth. All those, talking about translation worldviews and how thought is an interpretive process. Clifford Geertz, of course, not forgetting Clifford Geertz. Finally, the third category would be represented by the multidisciplinary translation studies scholars. Let's take L'Admiral, who is a translators of philosophy. He philosophizes about instances of translation. Antoine Berman, of course, with his Hegelian synthesis coming from the German Romantics and his philosophy of language, following, of course, and even influencing Paul Ricoeur. Chesterman with his memes of translation, Malmker, Weisbrod, Marais, and finally, Rainer Guldin. So let's quickly check about those three that I'm going to emphasize in red here: Chesterman, Marais, and Guldin. Some conceptual distinctions. Taking issue with Chesterman, I'm just going to come quickly to the idea that Chesterman doesn't speak of translation as a meme or a super meme beyond translation studies, as if translation is the privilege of translation studies scholarship only. The second conceptual distinction that I'd like to make with those authors, with regard to Guldin, notably here, in his book Translation as Metaphor, 2015, is that, you know, the issue for him is that as such, there is no philosophical or even meta-theoretical outcome from or impact that impacts translation studies, like a big picture, which is obviously philosophical. Translation metaphors are merely the gateway to possible but not demonstrated philosophical reflection, which is, of course, a good start. As for the third distinction with about Marais, he talks about semiotic translation, etc. And he's the only one who really speaks a little bit more, you know, kind of thoroughly about the notion of philosophy of translation. And so translation for him is an inherently complex and emergent phenomenon, which is both caused by a complexity phenomena and causes complex phenomena. However, although conceptualized in broader terms, translation is still merely illustrated as a linguistic and semiotic phenomenon, and you can see this in the second part of his book. So the question is Marais a philosophical framework that would be, you know, kind of good, you know, to develop a philosophy of translation? So he moves a little bit further than Timoshko by suggesting that one needs to conceptualize the field, not only the concept of translation. So conceptualizing translation studies as the lens through which you look at reality. So for him, translation studies becomes the field of study that studies all of reality from the perspective of intersystemic relationships, with a special focus on semiotic relationships and interlingual transfer, going backwards a little bit. So Marais becomes even more interesting when he says he thinks he's expanding Latour's thinking, not looking at the social as a substance, but as an assemblage of connections, freeing it from the subject-specific claims of either sociology or translation studies. So much so that he advocates for a widening and philosophical strengthening of the foundation of translation studies, in which a future field devoted to intersystemic relationship could develop, and he calls it intersystemic studies. However, many things are not very clear in Marais. What is the scope of the semiotic? How can he dispel reductionism from all systemic perspective? Despite complexity, where does his philosophy of translation stands in regard to translation studies, within or without? Why isn't translation equal to the notion that he coined interness? Why doesn't he want to define the nature of that concept? In fact, he's designing an ontology, or is he designing an epistemology? And when I asked him, he wasn't clear about it. So in terms of metaphorism, you know, represented by Rainer Guldin, my purpose is here to propose that a philosophical framework that not only, you know, kind of integrates metaphorism, but also goes beyond because Despite the pervasiveness of the translational metaphor, interlingual translation is not necessarily the only instance of translation proper, and not all other instances of translation are necessarily metaphorized. A philosophy of translation, I believe, cannot be conflated with its theories. It can, at the least, amount to a meta-theory, and at the most, to a worldview. A philosophy of translation cannot be content with the figurative ability of translation, meaning to metaphorize it only, but aims at discovering its heuristic power and how it can be an analytical tool of all sorts of dimensions of reality. So here's my thesis. For me, a philosophy of translation should raise the following questions. The questions of plurality of notions behind one single term. What are the multiple definitions of translation? The question of why and should we, especially in translation studies, be concerned by them? And also the question of relationship between fields of knowledge. How can disciplines and research interact and expand knowledge? And about the role of translation at the epistemological level in the formation of global knowledge or collective intelligence as conceptualized by Pierre Lévy. How does knowledge move, transform, and grow on local, global scale? So my suggestion here is this notion of translation as an archetype. After observing many fields of knowledge, disciplines, and practices, it appears that translation is a widespread word, term, metaphor, process, product, a common fact of many areas of life and knowledge, but most interestingly, a prevalent concept, if defined at a higher abstract level, that permeates a wide cluster of neighboring concepts. However, these multiple instances of the concept have some unifying characteristics. For example, what makes of the process of creating proteins in biology a translation? What is, or for that matter, immigration, migration, dream interpretation, social articulation, geometrical move, political agonism, science communication, or medical research turned into clinical use. All of these are called and described as translation and not merely metaphors. So why is that? Two main reasons. They have common characteristics. Not all are sufficient and necessary. Connection, articulation, negotiation, to kind of overcome disparity. Transfer, which is a spatial dimension. Transformation, which is temporal dimension. And functionality regulation, with this idea that translation is a regulated process. And the second thing is that they reflect a pattern within the human psyche in the way to represent instances of regulated change as translation. So the motive or the pattern is archetypal. For example, it's unconscious and it's universal and collective, and induced from observation as it's an elementary and a basic structure. It's also, if we speak in Kantian terms, it's a priori category. So referring to Jung, who came up with this notion of archetype, the archetypes are, as it were, the hidden foundation of the conscious mind. They are a priori categories of possible functioning. Archetypes are like templates. This is an important word. Templates for organizing the universal themes that recur over and over again in human experience. From this understanding of translation, I would like to suggest that the archetype of translation is the template of all phenomena and processes featured by the dialectical relationships of connectedness, articulation, transfer, and or transformation, and with a function and in a regulated manner, with or without subjective intent. So we can see here the dialectics of an arch of that super concept, if you'd like, or a supra concept or meta concept of arch translation, with all these four characteristics. So how to define arch translation? Arch translation is then a heuristic conceptual tool that allows to recognize and describe all instances of archetypal translation at the levels of semiotics, discourse, theories, and worldviews, at the least, right? So the question here is, what is the scope of this meta concept? I think the question is also, what is the usefulness, the scope and usefulness of that concept? Where does it actually operate? In a nutshell, everywhere its main features, characteristic, can be identified. For example, at the research level, arch translation can serve as a heuristic tool to philosophize translation within and without the discipline. Within disciplines, like in translation studies, but also without in other disciplines. Between disciplines, inter and transdisciplinarily, across disciplines, across epistemic culture, between humanities, social sciences, and even natural sciences. What I'm proposing is not a mere concept, but a conceptual template that serves to offer translation studies a space for a philosophy of translation, propose for translation studies an inter, and transdisciplinary research program that could respectively identify and explain instances of functional articulations, transfer, and transformation. Prospectively, it would suggest some heuristic methods to connect, transfer, and transform new instances of translation. So just to take an example that is a retrospective example. In political philosophy, Chantal Mouffe's notion of chains of equivalence allows to connect, articulate, and transform political disparities into a resistance against hegemony, social and political activism. In education, for example, the transformation of the learner and the teacher, as well as the articulation of her identity from the former to the latter, is translational, i.e., a dialectics of ontologies and epistemologies. Now, to take an example that is, I believe, retrospective, maybe not researched yet, and could be, the object of a research program, is to, for example, to develop the genomics in a given sociocultural context by a medical research in ethics would need a translational process. How so? To articulate the respective concepts and mutually translate them, right, between natural science and social science, and even psychology, all what makes up a society of human beings, to transfer to and hence transform the sage society, the common knowledge and awareness needed to go into genomics, because you need to educate people about genomics and what does it, bring to that society. So there are a whole bunch of different things to do in terms of transforming that society, which would entail, I think, a meta concept such as arch translation. So beyond education, this type of translation integrates and records the very processes of mental and actual transformation occurring at the level of a whole society. So, conclusion, let's end the presentation here because we're approaching the time limit. So arch translation is not the exclusive object of translation studies, but it could start there. I think translation studies scholars are privileged by being there and, kind of having this in their purview, but it happens to have emanated from it. Arch translation is a heuristic conceptual tool that serves the purposes of all relevant research on any natural, formal, or human phenomenon that combines part or all its characteristics, and hopefully engages researchers in looking at how instances of arch translation operate into, between, across disciplines. So I would like to finish here by conveying a couple of open questions. So the challenge now is to answer those following. Are concepts and theories of different epistemic culture really translatable into each other? Many have tried to answer this question, but I think it's still an open one, especially today that we are encouraged a lot, these kind of cross-disciplinary dialogues and cooperations. And given the increasing trend toward overarching approaches in translation studies and beyond, does arch translation apply to systemic thinking? Thinking a hint to our friend and colleague Cobus Marais. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, and I hope we'll be having a lot of questions to debate together. Thank you.